Hello, this is Ron. I received some bad news this past week. My brother Jim has fallen gravely ill and is currently in hospice care. There's little hope that he will recover, but who can say? My brother is without any doubt this show's greatest fan. He never missed an episode and was always quick to point out what he liked, loved, and thought, well, that might be questionable. A lot of what you hear on the show, segments, stories, and even the format were based on his suggestions. He was as much a part of what I do as I am. Jim is my older brother. We've done so much together over the years that I'm not even sure what I will do without him. He took me to my first Trailblazer game, fostered my interest in reading, and we would spend hours talking about everything from Star Wars to getting the Elam ending in the NBA. He wrote 4 books, provided us with 8 incredible stories, has 2 sons, and has been married to Lynn, his wife, for well over 40 years. By profession, he's a Lutheran pastor. He would go all over the country starting new churches and ended his career in Rio Rancho, New Mexico. Jim loved the desert there, and he truly was enchanted by the land of enchantment. Today's show is dedicated to my brother Jim. What you'll hear today are 3 stories that he loved. One comes from himself and his trip to Scotland. It was his only appearance on the podcast and is one of my favorite interviews that I have ever done. Also, we have a second story from Scotland and one from India. The format of the show is going to be a bit different than you're used to because a lot of it comes from 2017. I was still figuring out how to record a solid phone conversation back then. But even with that, I think you're going to enjoy it. As for my brother, I ask that you remember him and his family in your thoughts and prayers. Thank you. Hello and welcome to the podcast. This is Ron's Amazing Stories. We have stories that should thrill you a little and chill you a little.
It's amazing.
What you'll hear are adventures sent in by you guys, classic stories from the pulp mags, and episodes from the golden age of radio. We have special segments like Ghost Stories with Sylvia.
That's amazing.
And Paranormal Expeditions.
I think we're going to have a lot of fun.
So settle in for the next hour and enjoy the show. One more thing. You just might want to prepare yourself to be taken away from today.
Another 5-minute mystery.
This 5-minute mystery is being brought to you by Backseat Drivers. Have you got yours? Studies show that nothing ruins a drive in the country like the dreaded backseat driver. So pick up yours today.
Lieutenant Evans, Homicide Bureau.
Lieutenant, this is Dr. Norton at the city hospital.
Oh, yes, Doctor. What can I do for you?
I'm afraid I have some business for you, Lieutenant. I have a corpse down here that may be of interest to you.
I'm only interested in a certain type, Doctor. Unless this is a case
This is directly in your line, Lieutenant Evans. It's murder.
Where's your late patient, Doctor?
In here, Lieutenant Evans.
The identification on the fellow?
No, his pockets were empty. Well, there's your man, or what's left of him.
Pretty well carved up, isn't he?
Yes. Death was caused by a knife into the heart. All the other wounds were merely an anticlimax. Speaking medically, of course.
Which one of your ambulance men picked him up?
Oh, I'm sorry. I should have told you before this. But he was brought in here by a motorist who picked him up at the side of the road.
Did you get the fellow's name and address?
I did better than that, Lieutenant. I asked him to wait until you got here.
Good. I'll see him right away. Where is he?
In my office. Down this way.
I have a hunch he'll prove interesting. A man who'll give a ride to a corpse. Tell me, Mr. Scott, what time was it when you picked up the body?
I should say it was about 11 o'clock in the evening, Lieutenant.
I drove directly to the hospital after that. That was a pretty isolated road you picked to go riding on, Mr. Scott. It's an old habit of mine to avoid the holiday weekend traffic, Lieutenant. I always use the back roads.
Was the body still bleeding when you found it?
I suppose so, Doctor. He was dead, but I put him in the back seat and rushed here as quickly as I could.
How long was that ride, Mr. Scott?
About a half hour, Lieutenant.
I estimated the death to have occurred about 9 o'clock this evening.
That was an hour before Mr. Scott discovered the body. Well, that's about all the information I'll need right now, Mr. Scott. You'll be asked to come to the coroner's inquest, of course.
I don't mind that, Lieutenant, but my time is rather valuable. I hope to be compensated for it.
I'm sorry, but I don't handle that angle for the city.
Is there any sort of claim I filed to get the back seat in my car fixed?
What happened to it?
The covers are all blood-soaked.
I told you I don't take care of that sort of stuff.
I thought murderers were your business, Lieutenant.
They are, but you don't mean...
I do, Lieutenant. If you pardon the doctor's intrusion, I'll have to diagnose Mr. Scott as suffering from a malignant case of murder.
What clue did Dr. Morton discover that led to his analysis of the crime? In just a moment we'll know, but first...
Okay, so are we confused again? Do we even have a murder case? Is our backseat rider a murder victim or a murderer? It's like my dad used to say, backseat drivers are like backseat killers. They both talk themselves to death. This 5-Minute Mystery is being brought to you by backseat drivers everywhere.
And now, back to our story.
That's a bad guess, Dr. Norton.
Only on your part, Scott, in thinking you could get away with it. You tipped your hand when you tried to get compensation for being courteous enough to take your victim to a hospital. I stated that he'd been dead for 1.5 hours when you brought him here. You claimed to have found the body an hour after its death. Assuming that to be true, the back seat of your car never would have been soaked with blood. The only circumstances that could have made that possible were for you to have killed him in that back seat, where he bled to death.
Backseat drivers and backseat killers. They're all alike. They just talk themselves to death.
Okay, that has to be one of the strangest cases yet, and I have to go on record and say I do not understand the reference to backseat drivers at all. So, I'm going to change our sponsor to Dead Men Tell No Tales. Works for me.
What's that you say?
I have a story from a listener that is, well, frightening. Omar Kadri is a faithful listener who has contributed to the show before. He sends us this story as told to him by his mother. It comes from a time when she was still in the old country. Here is her story as told by Omar. When my mother was a young girl, she and her sister were playing a game in the neighborhood park with a group of friends. The park, Mother told me, was located near an ancient temple ruin that dates back thousands of years during the rule of the Hindu Kush. They controlled the northern parts of India, which is now Pakistan. It was late at night, and the game they were playing was called Red Fairy. It is similar to hide and seek. In the game, all the children hide, and the caller would say, "The red fairy is looking for you." That night, my mother's sister was the caller. "The red fairy is looking for you." Suddenly, my mother heard a scream that could only have come from her older sister. All of the kids scattered, out of fear, and ran to their nearby homes. My mother, of course, ran towards her sister. She caught up to her and then stopped dead in her tracks. She caught a glimpse of a woman dressed in red. The park's dim lighting illuminated the creature's clothing. When they got home, my mom's sister was hysterical. She kept repeating, "I saw the red fairy." She was crying, and my grandmother asked her what happened. Breathing wildly, she said, I was counting down when with my eyes closed and was saying, the red fairy is coming. When I opened my eyes, a woman shrouded in red garments was standing directly in front of me. I screamed and I ran. My mom said that her sister was sick for about 2 weeks after that and would not leave the house. From that day on, they never played late in that park again. However, the story does not end there. My grandmother told them both, years later, about a young woman who was murdered in the woods near the ancient ruins. She was found wearing red garments that night. Hence the tale of the Red Fairy. Omar Kadri. Well, Omar, that one sent shivers down my spine when I first read it. To you I say thank you for the taste of your heritage and for scaring the living daylights out of me. And now for something just as strange. Rosslyn Chapel was founded in 1446 as a place of worship, and services continue there today. Quick math should tell you that's 571 years. It was built by William St. Clair for his family. Rosslyn's extraordinary architecture and carvings have inspired generations, and it is a popular destination for visitors. Where is this chapel located? You will find it near the village of Rosslyn in Scotland. Now you might be asking yourself, why am I telling you about this place? Well, of course, it leads to a story. Not just any normal story, but one that can only be told by someone who has been to this amazing chapel, my very own brother. Welcome to the podcast, Jim.
It's great to be here. I've been looking forward to it.
Let's get this rolling. Introduce yourself and where you're from.
I live in Albuquerque, New Mexico, in the land of enchantment, a place full of its own mysteries and legends. Have lived here about 30 years. Used to live in Oregon. Presently, I work as a writer. For about 30 years, I worked as a mission developer. That's somebody that starts churches from zero. That's just about it.
So in the opening, I talked about Rosslyn Chapel. Did I get everything correctly?
Oh, yes.
Well, Jim, Rosslyn Chapel is amazing, and just researching it was fun for me. But you've been there a few times and have a story to tell.
Well, the story I'm going to tell is centered around Rosslyn and probably couldn't have taken place any other time. My wife, 2 sons, one at that time was in high school, the other in middle school, frequently traveled to the United Kingdom and particularly to Scotland. We were in Edinburgh, which is near Rosslyn, and I had read Lincoln and Bajan's book, The Blood of the Messiah. This was long before Dan Brown's novel had come out, and years before the movie came out. It was in the early 90s. And I had to see Rosslyn because it seemed to be connected with every mystery in the ancient world, everything from the Ark of the Covenant to the Holy Grail to the Knights Templar to the ley lines from Glastonbury. Every mystery you could come up with in some way was centered around or touched on Rosslyn Chapel. So we had to go. It's an easy drive from Edinburgh. You leave the city, go out into the country. There are fields and trees. You turn on a little road, at least back in those days. This was before the hordes of tourists descended on the place. And you would come into a little village, and there you would see this dark, extraordinary building. The building itself was part of a cathedral that was once going to be built that, based on what was built, must have been mind-wrenching to just imagine it. The portion that was built is the choir. It's 2 stories tall from the outside, but really only 1 story with a high roof. About 100 to 120 feet from end to end. The initial impression that I had, and remember this was the early 90s, before it was famous or many pictures were circulated, was that there was a feeling something odd about it. It was a little disturbing. The main thing about the exterior was so many sculptures. The stone that it was built with was largely rough-hewn. It didn't have the smooth look that you might expect of a famous church or any of that. It was dark, a little foreboding. Some people describe it as lovely, and if you look at modern pictures of it, it's been renovated a bit and cleaned up, but it still looks odd. The oddest part about it are 8 dark towers on each side of the building, each pointed at the top. They don't come out of the roof, they come out of the ground, they're adjacent to the building. And the first thing you ask yourself is, why so many towers and why so many carvings? You can't help but wonder, what is this place? And is it really a church? Well, when you walk in, you get your answer. I think it was Dan Brown who said that there isn't a single inch of the interior of Rosslyn Chapel that isn't carved. And the thing is, the carvings are almost entirely Norse and Celtic mythology, if that. Most of the carvings are grotesque, frightening. There are dragons, there are heads half human, thrusting out into the room 3 or 4 feet. There's more than 100 green men. Green men are symbols of fertility, some of them smiling, wonderful faces. They're circular with a face on them, some of them with terrifying faces.
I'm actually looking at some pictures right here, and they look like just evil cherubs almost.
That's the way many have been described. It's not clear whether this is meant to be a church or some sort of deviltry. You look around you, there's a Jahrhundertsrill, a pillar that extends from the floor to the ceiling, surrounded by either a serpent or a vine. Mm-hmm. And the Jahrhundertsrill is an ancient symbol, a tree that had its roots in hell, extended through the earth and rose up into heaven and united all the world together. But it has no place in Christian theology. Again, some people wonder if the thing is even a church. Mm-hmm. The man who built it, Sinclair, or St. Clair, either way, was a person with deep roots in Scottish Masonic ritual, and supposedly was a protector of the treasure of the Knights Templar, which were wiped out in the 1300s because they were considered a danger to the church and heretic and all of this. So you have this history there, which makes you kind of expect something unusual, but not this unusual. But I'll tell you the most amazing thing. The roof is unsupported, which is kind of amazing by itself. There are sections of wood frame, and between them, panels that extend from the left to the right side of the building. These panels all have something odd on them.
Mm-hmm.
But as a person from New Mexico, what struck me was two panels in particular. One was a series of yucca plants. You're in Scotland. The last thing you expect to see is 10 or 12 yucca plants from one end of the building to the other, painted onto that ceiling. The other, even more extraordinary sight for me was corn stalks. Now remember, this was built in 1447. The corn stalks are well known to everyone. They are there. They are real. But where in the world did they come from, given that corn was unknown in Europe? It's a New World plant that supposedly grew up somewhere in the Southwest. A lot of archaeologists think corn cultivation began here in the Rio Grande Valley where I live.
Yeah, that's always been my understanding, is that it's a Native American thing.
Oh, absolutely, it's Native American. What doesn't make any sense is why yucca and corn? There are traditions that a member of the Sinclair family took the treasure of the Knight Templars, brought it to the New World, and journeys to the New World in the 15th century were fairly common, and hid it there where the Catholic Church that was searching for it could never find it. But the theory was that he hid it in Labrador, Newfoundland, or someplace like that. How the heck do you account for something completely out of Southwest America, thousands of miles, or at least 2,000 miles, from the East Coast?
I'm sitting here looking at these photos, and number one, the animals particularly, that I guess they're animals, look very similar to those that I've seen on the pyramids of the Incas.
You know, that's interesting. What you do see reminds you of anything but a Christian church. There is a grotesque quality that seems designed to frighten. And it makes you wonder, what was the purpose of putting these things up? There's one that stretches out 3 or 4 feet from the wall that has the head of a leopard, sort of.
Yep.
But it's not really a leopard. You wonder what that is. And how did that function in worship? What are you thinking?
I don't know, but I'm also looking at that exact thing that you're talking about. There's a picture here. And I'm going to tell the listeners, what I did while Jim started talking was I just Googled Rosslyn Chapel and opened up the images, and I'm seeing all these things that he's talking about, including the windows. But specifically, I see this 3-foot puma-looking thing, and it is so aggressive-looking. I don't understand. I don't get it.
That's the point. It's really hard to get. And you wonder if the guy had ever finished a massive cathedral, what that would have looked like. It would have been a world center of something. But let me tell you about an additional secret. There is a sub-basement at Rosslyn. You can't go there anymore. But remember, this was before it became famous. At the south end of the building, there's a series of stairs that lead to a small room. And inside that room, it's a completely different world. It's maybe about 20 feet by 20 feet square. It has a fairly low roof. And it's completely different, not a carved image in it. I've been to Jerusalem, and I felt like I was in one of the Crusader chapels that are all over Israel, and they all have a certain feeling and color, mauve, brown, gray, and that is nothing like Scotland. I felt thousands of miles away down in the Middle East somewhere. It was a complete transformation for me. And it was not hard to imagine that something like the Holy Grail, not in Dan Brown's sense, but the Holy Grail in the sense of an object, or the Ark of the Covenant, which has its own legends and powers, or even the treasure of the Knights Templar could have been stored in that place.
Easily.
I loved the place. I felt comfortable there as opposed to the chapel above, which was in some ways uncanny, disturbing.
It looks amazing and makes me want to go see the place. But I have to ask, what happened to you there?
Well, after touring the chapel, what we did was we went out the door and separated. My wife went to visit the village in the area. It was in those days, who knows what it is now, but it was a tiny little place, and she was going to look around. My guys saw that there was a viewpoint, and we headed to the right and looked at the viewpoint, and it was remarkable. There is a vale, or you could say a ravine, not very deep, filled with a few scattered trees and some grass. And across the way is the castle of the Sinclair family. It's quite an imposing structure, but about 200 yards away from the chapel itself. There was a trail leading down into the ravine, and to the left was woods. You could call it maybe about an acre. Not very thick, deciduous trees, not imposing at all, but my guys like to explore everywhere, and we let them do that. So they headed down a trail from the viewpoint where I was standing and went to the bottom of the ravine, and there was another trail going up and down the ravine, and they turned left, followed that trail to the left, and walked into that little forest just to see what was going on. I thought, well, it's just fine, let them look around, and I spent time looking toward the castle, which is kind of pretty. I noticed time passing, and it was really hard to understand because the forest couldn't have been more than about an acre. I didn't know where they'd gone or what they were doing. 15 minutes passed, 30 minutes passed, and I knew that my wife would want to be going, so I started shouting for them. And nothing, There was already a kind of uncanny feeling in the air you got just from visiting Rosslyn Chapel. And I was thinking, this isn't right, that those guys should have come out of that thing in 5 minutes. And I headed down the slope. I was going to go get them. I got about 2/3 the way to the bottom of the ravine when all of a sudden I noticed bees.
Did you say bees?
Bees,
Oh,
as
my
in
goodness.
buzz bees.
Okay, you're already scaring me.
Don't like bees, and I wasn't very happy about that and started to turn back, thinking I must have disturbed the hive. As soon as I turned back, I looked back, and I saw something I will never forget for the rest of my life. And that is, there was an impenetrable black tower of bees standing right over me. I'm 6'2", This tower was at least 2 feet over my head, and I could not see through it. It was jet black, nothing but bees. I was struck with terror. I thought, at best, I'm going to end up in a hospital in this foreign land. At worst, I could see myself dying right there, and I was pretty sure I was going to. I started, of course, running up the slope, but couldn't do that because going up the slope, I discovered it was mostly scree and loose stones. So I was crawling as madly as I could, and all of a sudden, the top of that ravine looked a mile away. But I crawled and crawled and crawled, and absolute terror, maybe the greatest terror I've ever had in my life, until I dragged myself over the top, back up to the top, and quickly looked back. Not a bee in sight.
Wow.
I know. It was just like that. And remember, in this setting with Rosslyn Chapel only a few feet away, just 20 feet away, and you're in this already enchanted world. Well, I stood up, and now I was deeply concerned about what had happened to my guys. And I started shouting more and more, but Lord knows I wasn't going to go down that trail again.
I don't blame you.
15 more minutes passed. We're talking 45 minutes in the woods the size of a handprint. And finally, after about 50 minutes, I was relieved when I saw my oldest son, followed by my youngest son, come out of the woods.
Huh.
They came to that same junction and started up, walked up the slope, no bees, nothing at all, and came to the top. And of course, I was completely confused. What had happened? What took you guys so long? There was no plan that they would go for a long hike. And they told me an extraordinary story. That when they entered the woods, it totally changed for them. It became thick and dark and seemed to be much larger than they had thought. They were walking in the woods and heard voices, children's voices, singing and playing and all making music. There were musical instruments and all sorts of things. And they thought there might be a day school or something over there, and they just decided to walk and see what was going on. And they got deeper and deeper and deeper into this forest, which got darker and darker. They finally reached a point where there was a sort of a clearing, but not a clearing open to the sun, a clearing where nothing grew except one very strange tree. The tree was bare, but from it hung square objects of various kinds that didn't look like anything in nature, but again, the word uncanny or enchanted comes to mind. I had no idea what they had seen. I couldn't even imagine it until I saw the movie Blair Witch Project.
Oh.
In which there is an image of a tree with things hanging on it that is terrifying to this day to me, because I know it's exactly what my sons saw. Well, at that point, they were scared. And they turned around to get out of the woods, and lo and behold, just a few steps, a few minutes, and they were back in the morning sunshine of Rosslyn, coming across the bottom of that valley. They were shaken. It was a totally strange experience. We went and found my wife, who was waiting in the car, wondering where we all had gone. And that was nearly the end of the story. When I got home to Albuquerque, I talked to a friend I have. She is a Druid priestess, and I mean by that the real thing, a real expert in Druid magic arts and lore. And she's also a real expert on Christian theology and can talk about theologians and their work that most people have never heard of. In other words, she's the real deal. So I went to her as the expert and told her the story I just told all of you. And she said very quickly, those were brownies. I had no idea what that was, but she explained to me that brownies were small, little people, smaller than leprechauns, about a foot high, not much more. They're famous for being mischievous, but can be malevolent, but also can be kind and helpful. You never know which. One of their favorite things to do was to lead travelers off their path by making sounds of children playing and draw them deeper and deeper into the woods to the point where they would get so twisted up and lost that sometimes they'd never find their way out. Well, I had personally, when she described it, no better explanation for what my guys had encountered, especially at this place so full of extraordinary, frightening, disturbing, and mysterious images. And I have felt that we encountered something of the lore of Scotland in a very living way. I've been back to Rosslyn many times. It's changing. It's becoming a tourist attraction now. But I am really grateful for the chance to visit there before hardly anybody knew about it. We were basically, as a family, alone there. And it was quite a visit.
So I'm curious as to what your Druid friend said about your experience with the bees.
You know, I really didn't ask her about that. I should have, but I didn't. I was mainly interested in the voices that the boys heard. My focus was on what happened to my guys. What had they encountered? I knew what I had encountered. I have no idea what that's rooted in.
Were you stung at all?
Not a sting, not a touch, not a bit, not a broken anything, completely harmless.
And that leads me to believe that what you experienced had to have something to do with what your boys experienced. They have to be somehow related.
Well, my feeling at the time was clear that the bees were designed to keep me from going down there and finding the guys. And that whoever wanted to mess with my guys was doing it on their own and were making their own mischief, but somehow the bees cooperated in it. I had no doubt of that.
Well, it's interesting because on the program, on the podcast, we've had stories of fairy and brownie before, and what you're describing is very similar to the stories that we've had here. And it always is somebody out in the wilderness being led astray.
I have a feeling, again, because of some of the people I've known and talked to, that the stories that are told in the Celtic world, and especially Scotland and Ireland, have a basis. If you go, say, visit a stone circle, which are all, it isn't just Stonehenge, there's stone circles all over those regions, many of them not even signed, and you go into these stone circles, you feel an energy. There's something there. There's a mystery history in that land that makes it easy to believe some of the stories about mythical beings and strange little people. And of course, there is the true history of the Picts, which lived in Scotland, who were a little people unrelated to anybody else, who fought everybody, Roman and English, all sorts of people. They were described like part of the earth that lived in that country from ancient times and are still in many ways mysterious. They're real. People have records of fighting these people, and it says that there was something going on besides the ordinary in those northern lands.
Going back, the carvings in the chapel itself, looking back on them and then listening to your story, I look at these things and I see tricksters in my mind. I see somebody that could be potentially, hey, I'm going to have me some fun here. This is what I'm going to do. And do you recall those carvings?
Oh, I recall all the carvings, but the thing is, there are so many. It's a rioting. They aren't separate from each other. There's a carving, and an inch away from it, another carving. As Dan Brown said, there isn't a single piece of uncarved stone. So you look over the thing, and it's like you're staring into a forest of faces. What you do get is the overwhelming impression of something extraordinary that has nothing to do with a church and everything to do with a kind of spirituality that you, as the observer, probably don't even understand. What is that doing inside the so-called Christian church, where they still, as you said, have worship services? Who do they worship?
I don't know, but it's eerie. Like I said before, what I did for me was I just did a Google search for Rosslyn Chapel and then clicked on images, and then you are just flooded with these images that Jim and I that have been talking about for the last 30 minutes. And I encourage you to go look at these. I'm going to put a little warning, though. If you got small children, you might not want to show them a couple of them.
Oh, many of them are terrifying.
Yeah, they all seem somewhat aggressive. I mean, there's snakes, like you said, like they're coming out of a wall, and then there's these cherub things, and then these half puma, or maybe half lion, half whatever, and they're all just looking like they're ready to pounce on you, and could do so at any moment.
It's an unforgettable visit, that's for sure. Just be aware, they say it's like Times Square in there these days.
Yeah,
we were lucky to go early in the 1990s before Dan Brown and all of this.
Well, Jim, I got to thank you for sharing this with us, all of what you've told us. I have a feeling that we're going to get a lot of response from people on this one. And if you've been to Rosslyn, maybe you had a similar experience, I would love for you to share that with us and tell us about your experience with Scotland. Well, Jim, one of the things that we talked about, we mentioned that you were an author. And not only are you an author, but you're an author of 4 books.
4 books, all available with my author name as Jim Thompson. And they're at Amazon. And one of the favorite selling titles is a novel I wrote. It's called Kali, Kali. That's the title of the book. It's a murder mystery full of quantum physics and esoteric mysteries and all sorts of good things. And if you start there, you'll find my other books listed right along with it.
And you also are a blogger. You have your own blog that is, right now, you're using to chronicle your experiences with getting your leg back.
It's meant to offer encouragement for anyone that's going through hard times. It's called JamesAThompson.blog. It's uplifting, as I say, encouraging, and offers some insights for living that I couldn't have gained in any way other than going through this crazy experience of amputation, rehabilitation, and now recovery.
And I've actually read quite a bit of the blog, all of it, in fact, and it is just, well, I'm going to use the word amazing. And I highly recommend it. That was JamesAThompson.blog.
That's it.
Well, Jim, I can see by the clock on the wall it is time for you to go. At least I get to stick around and tell some more stuff.
I gotta say, I love your show. I look forward to it every week. I love the stories. I love the old-time radio. I especially love the 5-minute mysteries.
Sometime I'm going to have you come on and we'll just talk about that, because we've talked about that offline, and we both have a similar view of those 5-minute mysteries. They are a lot of fun.
They are.
All right. Well, thank you again, Jim, for sharing your story, and thank you for being with us today.
My pleasure.
Wow. That truly is an amazing story. I want to thank my brother, Jim, for taking the time to be on the podcast today. If you missed any of the links and want to see some of the pictures that we were talking about, head over to ronsamazingstories.com and we'll have them in the show notes. That story, well, that's one for the ages. Thank you, Jim. Did you know that Ron's Amazing Stories is sponsored by Audible? Audible is home to over 180,000 audiobooks, any of which can be yours. All you have to do is sign up for a 30-day free trial, and Audible will give you a free book and access to their original content. To download your free audiobook, go to audibletrial.com/Ron's Amazing Stories. Thank you, Audible.
As read by Amazing Stories, read by amazing people.
This time on As Read By, we have an amazing story sent in by Rebecca Maitland. Rebecca hails from Inverness, which is a city in the Scottish Highlands. Its name literally means mouth of the River Ness. The River Ness flows from the northern end of Loch Ness, which we all know is the reputed home of Nessie, the Loch Ness Monster. How about that? Rebecca has written a story she says is true and adds, Krafman he klus, but truth gangs nicht. Now, I don't know what that means, but I'm pretty sure I just butchered the Gaelic language. Here is her story, as read by me. I love a good ghost story. My mother was fond of reading them to us just before bedtime. Some might think this an odd practice, but she always told us that a ghost can never harm ye if you trust in God. Which we did. So we looked forward to story time every night. One of the stories she told us many times, and it always rang true with each telling. After I'd all grown up, I asked Mom about the story, and she told me it is true. It took place below the mountain en route for the Loch Ness. Here is my mom's tale. I tell it as she did to me more times than I could count the sheep in the hills. A young girl and her brother were walking along an old rover's trail on the North Mountain bits. They had done so many times, and each time they always felt like they were being watched. The trail was never the same because with each rain the stream would jump its bank and more often than not would settle back into a new path. So the two were searching for a good place to cross. They came across the vestige of a smiling young girl, dressed in a blue-green watery outfit, sitting on a slab of rock amidst the fast-moving water. She was pointing to the water, enticing the walkers to cross. The older looked to her brother and then to the stream. The flow of the stream was much too strong and surely would have pulled them away. They tried to talk to the little girl, yell really, to help her. She spoke not a word and seemed totally unconcerned about her plight. The two had no choice and continued on the banks of the stream, leaving the thing waving and pointing at the river. They walked for some time, but finally found a safe place to cross. As quickly as they could, the two ran back to the stone and found it empty. The girl was gone. Fearing for the child, they looked around but found no sight of her. Giving up, they continued their walk home. As part of the trip home, they had to pass through a narrow valley called Pole Ghost, or in English, Ghost Hole. They had been warned to always stay on the path when passing through. As long as you did, the fairy could not take you. About halfway through, the siblings looked on top of the hill, and there stood the little girl waving at them, beckoning. Both brother and sister felt the pole so much and wanted to go to the spirit, their heads filled with images of candies and cakes and Irish creams. The boy started to run up the grassy knoll. His sister quickly tackled him, thankful for the times that the two had wrestled together, and dragged him back to the path. "You stay here, wee one. Will not be a fairy's dinner this day." She shook her brother until she could see the light in his eyes again. They both walked the whole of the valley, not looking up for the rest of the trip through the Pole Ghost. As they came out the other side, the girl was there again. This time she pointed to the east. A place called Corrisk Coinin, or in English, Rabbit's Marsh. This one was easy for the two because they'd been told by their father to never go there alone. Their fear of their father was greater than the pull of this ghost. The girl yelled, "May the cat eat you, and the devil eat the cat." And with that, the girl beast faded and was gone. The sister looked at her brother, and they both agreed that they'd had quite enough for that day and ran all the rest of the way home to tell their mother what had happened. I don't know if my mother was the girl in this story. Neither she nor my uncle will ever say for sure. They both do, however, seem to share a smile each time the subject is broached. I will say that I've always felt that there is truth in every story told. It has always been a tradition in Scotland to tell stories to your children, the idea being that you can better teach with stories than you can with lectures. Thank you for allowing me to share my story, and I hope the RAS listeners enjoy it. Rebecca Macklin. I love that story, Rebecca. I don't care if it's true or not, you are a fantastic storyteller. No doubt an artifact of your upbringing. I did do a bit of research on this, and I found this Googling the search of paranormal stories from Scotland. This one made me go, huh. In May of 2011, Ben Adler was hiking below a mountain en route for Loch Ossian. He was following an old drover track while looking for a suitable spot to cross a stream. Sound familiar? He noticed the image of a smiling young girl sitting on a slag of rock. She was pointing to the river, enticing him to cross. Ben panicked and moved further downstream, crossing at a point where the water was calmer. He never caught sight of the girl again. Coincidence or confirmation? I'm going to leave that for you to decide, but consider what Rebecca said. There is truth in every story told. To Rebecca, I say thank you so much for your story. To the listeners, I say send me your stories. I'll read them right here, or you can read them yourselves. All you got to do is send an email to ronsamazingstories@gmail.com, and you too can share. You know you want to. Just do it.
They'll know you've arrived when you drive up in the 1958 Edsel, the car that's truly new from nameplate to tail lights. New from the front. New from the side. New from the rear. Only Edsel has the sleek, clean line design that sets it apart from the look-alike cars. And it combines new looks with the newest V8 engines in the world, the big new Edsel 400 and the power-packed Edsel 475. It is unlikely you have ever driven a car with so much real, usable power as the Edsel. And with Edsel's exclusive Teletouch drive, you drive more safely, more easily than you ever have before, because both hands can stay at the wheel while the Edsel shifts electrically. There's even the added luxury of new Edsel air suspension that's just like riding on air, because you are. And remember, of all the medium-priced cars, car for car, across the board, the 1958 Edsel is the one that's new and the lowest price, too. So see your Edsel dealer.
That was episode number 514, and Omar Kadri, Rebecca Macklin, and of course my brother Jim made it happen. Please remember my brother and his family in your thoughts and prayers. Thank you. If you want to follow the podcast or the blog, head to ronsamazingstories.com. There you will find any of the links I mentioned and how to contact us. Do you want to help the show? The best thing you can do is to tell your friends all about it, and please leave reviews or feedback wherever you listen. Clicking that follow or like button makes us grow. Thank you for listening, and I hope you come again to find out what are Ron's Amazing Stories.